Welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. Jody is out today. Today we're doing things a little differently. So usually we discuss a few different topics, but in this episode we're only focusing on one, and that's the gun debate. Because last Wednesday, Valentine's Day, 19-year-old former student Nicholas Cruz opened fire with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle on students and teachers at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. He killed 17 people and wounded 14 others. And we're focusing on the gun debate, of course, in response to this heartbreaking news, but also because it's a debate that poses interesting questions and challenges for people who focus on public opinion and the political process like we do here at 538. And so here with me around the table are Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver. Hey, Nate.
Hey, Galen.
Senior politics writer Claire Malone.
Hey, Galen.
Hey, Claire. How's it going? Haven't heard that in a while. And politics editor Micah Cohen. Hey.
Hey.
This must be quite a trip for all of the people who think we're the same person.
And we will try to distinguish ourselves today.
That's Micah readers.
Listeners. Yeah. If you hear anything smart, I said it. Anything stupid, Galen said it.
I mean, that goes without saying, right?
Galen's wearing glasses, you guys.
Yeah, you can definitely tell in my voice that I'm wearing glasses. I'll also note that we did discuss Mueller's indictment of 13 Russians in an emergency podcast last Friday. So if you missed that, you can go check it out. And of course, that's a story that we will continue discussing. But today, we're going to structure our conversation in three parts. First, we're going to look at public opinion. Then we'll look at how the political process has played out and some of the successes of gun rights supporters. And then we'll look towards the future and look at where trends are headed. But to start, Nate, what do the top line numbers say about Americans' views of gun control?
So, look, in some ways, we want to devote the full hour, or I'm not sure it's an hour, right, but the full show to this question of why is there a disparity between apparent measures that show the public in favor of more gun control and a culture where there's not a lot of gun control in the United States? You know, why does that occur? Micah, you're grimacing.
I oppose that framing.
Why do you oppose that framing?
That framing presupposes that certain poll questions are a more accurate reflection.
Don't use
the word bro on
the podcast.
Listen,
I'm going to use bro on the podcast, bro. Look at the way I actually framed my answer, which was apparent. And if you hadn't interrupted me...
Emphasis on apparent.
If you had interrupted me, I would say one way to resolve that dilemma would be by saying that actually these polls that people look at, showing whatever 90-some% for background checks, are not representative of the broader state of public opinion. Another way to resolve it would be to say that, hey, people are more intense on one side than the other. And a kind of third way would be to say, hey, look, that there's a status quo, there's an equilibrium, and politicians are scared of taking action on guns for no good reason, right? So there are lots of different answers to that question.
But where do the polls stand?
Do I look like some type of polling expert?
I mean, we can get into debate over which polling numbers we trust more or less, or why people respond the way that they do in certain contexts, but let's get those numbers out there to begin with, at least.
Well, we've got here that a 2017 Gallup poll showed that 60% of Americans want more strict gun control regulations. 33% want to keep it as is. There's a pretty strong favorability for background checks. 96% of people want background checks and 30-day waiting periods, that kind of thing.
I think, to a first approximation, guns as an issue in the abstract and overall about evenly divide Americans. People are polarized. When you get into specific gun control proposals, policy proposals, there's broad support. So that's how I would.
Right. And what you mean by that first thing is the way that Pew, for instance, has phrased that question is, what do you think is more important, to protect the right of Americans to own guns or to control gun ownership? So basically, when it's framed as a constitutional question, it splits people.
Yeah, and this is true of a lot of debates. I mean, people might remember back to the Obamacare debate, where Obamacare was quite unpopular and remained unpopular until recently as an abstract concept. But the specific parts of it, people were often fairly warm toward. And so it's kind of similar here. The questions are, number one, are you talking about a specific policy initiative, or are you talking in terms of values? Clearly, if you kind of frame it as a question of gun rights versus gun control, then people line up on either side of that pretty evenly. And the other question is kind of what types of trade-offs are you talking about? So background checks, people think, well, that might not affect me, and therefore, if I'm like not mentally ill or something, I'm not on the no-fly list, therefore that's okay. But when people start thinking about things that could affect their right to own and purchase a firearm, then it might be a little bit different.
But I guess, Nate, to your earlier apparent remarks, shouldn't we put more weight on the polling results that show America evenly divided because that matches up with the fact that there hasn't been any?
No, well, I mean, one of my big things is I think I don't place as much faith that the political process is quote unquote rational or quote unquote efficient.
Yeah.
You know, I think there can be equilibriums where action doesn't take place for a long time, then suddenly there's a catalyst or a shift and you're in a different equilibrium in terms of which issues become more or less relevant. I do think with the Parkland shooting, I'm not saying we've reached like a pivot. I do think like maybe we've turned a corner. We can kind of see a pivot because it stayed in the news for a while and survived actually a lot of competing news stories. That this whole set of Mueller indictments, which are a huge news story, did not derail this from the headlines. And very often with mass shootings, it takes just a gust of wind is enough to blow them out of the headlines because people are tired of it. So I think the fact that, number one, you have the students who are outspoken and talking about this issue. Now there's kind of a campaign, I think, to discredit those students. And secondly, you have the fact that this shooting feels like it was quite preventable based on the intelligence the FBI had and did not use, based on the fact that this student was ex-student, I should say, was clearly mentally deranged, right? This is not like, oh, he was the good kid who didn't know he was collecting all these assault rifles. It's like, this is one of them that they're not all preventable, but feels like this one should have been prevented. And so I think that might be changing the equilibrium on the debate a little bit.
Bringing it back to the disconnect in polling, you suggested that maybe it's people kind of changing their minds the closer the issue gets to affecting their own right to own guns. Do you, Micah and Claire, agree with that? I mean, is partisanship an issue here? How do you explain, both in the gun debate and in other policy issues, when on the details people seem pretty much in line, but then when you zoom out, you see more of a division?
I think it's a culture and partisanship thing. I think we'll talk about this later, but I do think that Republicans, the NRA, interest groups have done a really good job of making gun culture and a belief in Second Amendment rights an identifying issue in a way that many liberals will say I'm pro-choice, right? As sort of an identifying thing. I remember I was up in Maine during the last couple months of the election in upper rural Maine, and a Republican operative up there kind of talked to me about like orange vest, orange hat issues, which refers to what hunters wear when they go out hunting, right? These things that appeal to people who feel a cultural affinity. Often, I mean, they refer to it as kind of, hunting and athletic culture kind of thing. But it does speak to something else, which I think the modern Republican Party, sort of the Reagan Goldwater fidelity to, the Constitution and going back to your basic rights. Like what was Ted Cruz's campaign slogan? Like it was something about constitutional conservatism. I think if you talk a lot about the Second Amendment and preserving the Second Amendment, that dovetails very nicely with modern Republican Party ideals of who they are and who their voters are and what they care about.
The Ted Cruz slogan, according to a quick Google, is, quote, "Together we will win."
Okay, so
mine
maybe
is better,
not,
but there's certainly, he had a line in there that was about, I'm not making this up.
But are you saying then that it becomes less about actual policy?
So I totally agree with what Claire said.
Thank you. That's Micah. That's Micah, guys.
Yeah, Micah agrees with what Claire said. The Monkey Cage had this piece, and this put it better than I could, so I'm just going to quote it. It was by Matthew Lacombe. Quote, "Over the course of its more than 100-year history, my research shows the NRA developed a social identity for gun owners and then mobilized this group into politics by framing government gun regulation as a threat to gun owners' lifestyles, values, and traditions, an affront to gun owners and their very identities." So I think that's totally right, and I think that partly explains why when you ask particular policy questions like background checks or the watch list, it's moving the issue farther away from culture and identity.
From the abstract.
Exactly,
things,
right,
yeah.
to like particular policy. And so on those particular questions, you get more support. But on the issue overall, it cuts to the fundamental identity. For a lot of people, it's sort of like a proxy issue.
In the same way that
yeah.
like random things like the Waters of the United States Act, which is an environmental regulation that affects, frankly, very few people, but it became this sort of emblematic thing about regulation and over-regulation by the government, and the EPA has no business here or there. In the same way that when people will talk about gun control, it's about the government putting restrictions on you, and it speaks to some sort of, primordial conservative thing in American life of restricting rights and that being a bad thing.
Americans have not really always been divided on this. In fact, not so long ago, I mean, in the early 90s, it seems like Republicans and Democrats largely agreed and that there was much stronger support. I mean, I'm looking at Gallup. In 1991, 78% of Americans told Gallup they wanted stricter gun laws. That's down about, I guess, 18 points. If you also look at that Pew question about whether you prioritize gun rights or control of gun ownership, Republicans and Democrats did not disagree all that much, or not nearly as much as they do now. So what happened?
Oh, God, that's tough, mate.
I mean, every issue's become more polar over time. You know, one thing that is perhaps relevant is that Democrats and Republicans are more split along urban-rural lines, which still is the sharpest split in views on gun control.
Do you think it also had to do with, I mean, Columbine was, what year, 98? 99? I mean, I wonder if a little bit just, you know, as we've seen events like school shootings or shootings in movie theaters rise, if that doesn't just throw into sharper relief people's ideas about how to fix gun violence in America. Because, it, you know, people have been killing each other in, you know, listen, America, we're recording this from New York. New York had a huge problem with crime in the 70s and 80s, right? Like, people kill each other in urban areas with guns all the time, but there's something about those kids shooting up Columbine that really struck people.
Bunch of kids.
It was a bunch of kids. It was in suburban America. Like, that just, I think, probably raises a lot more feelings in Americans across the country over the decades, because it suddenly became, oh, well, guns are in cities, but guns aren't like a high school suburban thing. And then it takes the debate to places that wouldn't have reached, that gun violence wouldn't have reached before. It makes people feel an immediacy, a closeness to the issue.
Yeah, that's really important. So we have all these poll questions that show, like, over time, the problem is that this issue has unfolded in very different contexts over the decades. So, like, you know, originally when the Second Amendment became a thing, it was in the context of, you know, Black Panther activists wanting to carry guns. And you saw a reaction from Democrats and Republicans to enact stricter gun laws in response to that, right? Then it became, I'm abridging the history here, but then it became about crime in cities, right? Now the issue, as Claire just said, is much broader. The other thing is, like, it's easy to forget, but not that long ago, Democrats were very wary to come out strongly for gun control. So I'm not sure this latest shooting is a inflection point, as Nate was suggesting, or the beginning of an inflection point. But it could be in the sense that now the issue is closer to being fully polarized. And therefore, you know, I would expect, for example, the next time Democrats are in control of everything, they would do something on this.
Yeah, although, you know, actually, one of the things that increased support for gun rights in that kind of gun rights versus gun control question seemed to be the election of Obama in 2009. We talk a lot on the podcast about thermostatic public opinion, which is that whoever's in power on many issues, public opinion actually moves against the views of people who are in power. And so kind of maybe now with Trump, there's a different level of responsibility, where ABC News had a poll question where they asked, do you think Trump has done enough for Parkland? And I think 6 out of 10 people or something like that said, no, he has not done enough. That's different now, where Republicans are kind of in charge of providing for public safety, which is one of the many things that the people in charge of government have to do. And so that's a little bit different.
There was a belief on the right that Obama was going to come and take everyone's guns, and you saw
clinging to your guns and religion.
Yeah, people remember how much of a shit show. Can I say that on the podcast? I forget if we're allowed to swear.
Go for it.
It was quite a shit show when Obama was observed, I think, at a fundraiser or something.
Yeah,
talking about
in San Francisco,
how, you know, voters cling to guns and religion. And that's why, and that's kind of a big thesis you hear on the left, right?
And it was a very condescending comment.
Yeah.
I mean,
but so I think coinciding with Obama, and I'm not saying Obama caused this or maybe partly caused this, but I think you saw guns become more fully entwined with partisan identity and with cultural identity.
Sure. I don't think it's one thing, though. I think it's partisan identity. I do think that there was a rash of massacres over the past decade.
No, right.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
That I'd say it has multiple causes.
But, you know, gun sales spiked during Obama, right? Because people were scared he was going to do something.
People wanted to... I mean, for militias.
Yeah, no, and if you go back and read coverage, there's all these quotes from NRA people about how, oh, if Obama's elected to a second term, he's going to come and take your guns. Of course, that never happened. I'm trying to find it. I actually saw some report that since Trump was sworn in, gun sales have plummeted. Again, because people aren't scared that he's going to come get them.
So I want to get into the political strategy of gun rights supporters, and we have a guest who's going to do that with us. But before we move on, what about the demographics of gun rights supporters? We said Republican. Can we zoom in any more?
I think if you ran a regression analysis and you say what's the most predictive characteristic, that one is, are you urban or are you rural? And that probably outweighs everything else. And then 2 might be political ideology. 3 might be gender. Those are the 3 big ones. And to some extent race, but those kind of flow often from ideology and rural urban. Anyway.
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle, but rural, Republican, male, white, old.
Yeah.
And I will, just to stick in here, I that's all true. The NRA has also been trying to make appeals, though. There are marketing appeals for women to buy guns as like self-defense.
Okay, as we begin to talk about political strategy in the gun debate, I want to bring in a guest, Jill Lepore. But first, we have a word from this week's sponsors. This week's podcast is brought to you by Stitch Fix. You can tell a guy who's got style. He always looks great and seems confident, like he's ready for anything. Well, that takes a certain skill set that not all of us were born with. Well, I mean, the guys around this table, of course, I imagine, were born with it. But even if you're not, there's an easy way to look better. It's called Stitch Fix Men. Stitch Fix is the new way to shop for clothes, and it's unbelievably simple. Just go to stitchfix.com and answer some questions about your sizes, what styles you like, and how much you want to spend. Stitch Fix has clothes for every guy and his style. It's not just one type of look. Your personal stylist then uses your preferences and the other information you entered to select brand new clothes just for you. The items are delivered right to your home, you try them on, and only pay for what you keep. Just send anything you don't want back, and shipping is free both ways. Get your fix on demand or sign up to receive scheduled shipments. Guys of all shapes, sizes, and budgets agree. Defining your new style starts with Stitch Fix. So try them out today. You've got nothing to lose. Get started now at stitchfix.com/politics, and you'll also get 25% off when you keep all 5 items in your box. That's stitchfix.com/politics to get started today. Again, stitchfix.com/politics. This week's podcast is also brought to you by Casper Mattress. Can you imagine taking a car on a 100-day test drive? Or getting a new pair of shoes and having 100 days to walk around in them and feel how comfortable they are? Well, that's what Casper's doing, giving you 100 nights to test the Casper mattress in your own home with their 100-night sleep challenge. Seriously, think about it. It's 100 nights. You try it out, and you can see for yourself how you get a great night's sleep every night. The Casper mattress has a unique combination of foams that provide the right pressure relief and alignment, so you feel perfectly balanced and comfortable. It ships for free right to your door in a how on earth do they actually get it that small sized box. And don't sweat it if you don't love it. They'll come pick it up for free and give you a full refund. You've got nothing to lose. When the choice is to test a mattress by actually sleeping on it for 100 nights in your home, or going to a store and flopping around on a dozen or so mattresses for a few minutes each, it's a no-brainer. Take Casper's 100-night sleep challenge and you'll love your mattress, guaranteed. Right now, when you go to Casper.com and use code POLITICS, you'll save $50 off on select mattresses. That's code POLITICS at Casper.com to save 50% on select mattresses. Again, Casper.com, terms and conditions apply. Okay, back to the show. Okay, we're back, and joining us is Jill Lepore. She's a professor of American history at Harvard University and a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she wrote the piece, Battleground America, One Nation Under the Gun. Thanks for being with us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So we laid out where public opinions stand, and we want to dive right into the heart of things now. Why have gun rights supporters been more successful at enacting their agenda than gun control supporters?
I think the issue has essentially moved onto autopilot at this point, and that's part of the success. Before the 1970s, Guns were not a partisan issue, neither was abortion, and the two issues emerged over the course of the 1970s and 1980s as the most useful issues with which to get voters to the polls. They both rest on constitutionally weak foundations, and partisans found that you could whip voters into a fury about each, partly because they are genuinely weak constitutional issues. But where we are now has to do with that polarization that was accomplished more or less manually in the 1970s and 1980s having been automated. So the success that gun rights advocates have had is continuing largely by force of inertia at this point.
Jill, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the shifting interpretation of the Second Amendment, particularly by gun advocacy groups, and when that happened.
Sure. So the NRA was founded in 1871 as a sportsman's organization. It didn't have a political role. It didn't endorse a presidential candidate until 1980, until it endorsed Ronald Reagan, and that was after a huge restructuring of the organization and essentially a coup by political activists from the New Right who just took over the NRA at the time. The Second Amendment history then took a different course during Reagan's administration, when Reagan's Justice Department under Edwin Meese was really interested in cultivating as American constitutional doctrine the doctrine of originalism. Mm-hmm. And a new study was commissioned in Congress on the original meaning of the Second Amendment in a report that was a committee chaired, I believe it was Orrin Hatch, I'm not sure. Anyway, they went back and using this sort of Meesian originalism, reinterpreted the Second Amendment to say, oh my gosh, we've misunderstood the Second Amendment for centuries. We thought, which is actually very interesting, is what they were doing was offering a wholly new interpretation of the Second Amendment. But that's the interpretation that became the signature interpretation of the NRA, which at the time, had put over its headquarters the motto, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed, which is just half of the amendment. But it was really during the 1970s and early 1980s that the amendment was quite radically reinterpreted and then very effectively delivered as a political product of the New Right, so that I think it's not visible to many people how new that interpretation was at the time. That seems to be, and since it was packaged as we are restoring the original meaning of the amendment, it denies its own novelty.
And that reinterpretation was from the right for a militia to bear arms to the right of individuals to bear arms. Is that what you're referring to?
Frankly, the Second Amendment was hardly interpreted at all one way or the other for the first 2 centuries. Just wasn't considered particularly relevant to any political debates. States and cities regulated guns for all kinds of reasons from the start of the United States. Adam Winkler talks at great length about especially state-level gun control regulation in the 19th century in his book Gunfight, a really interesting history of legal efforts to regulate the ownership of guns. So, you couldn't carry a concealed weapon in a city, for instance, in most places in the 19th century. No one ever contested those as violations of the Second Amendment because the Bill of Rights hadn't been incorporated by the states at that point, for one thing. But when the first federal firearms legislation was passed in the 1930s, the Federal Firearms Act and the National Firearms Act in 1934 and 1938, those were challenged on constitutional grounds, citing the Second Amendment, but the Supreme Court, in a decision in 1939, ruled unanimously that the Second Amendment did not interfere with the right of the federal government to regulate the ownership of guns.
Jill, you've written a bit about the right to privacy and how the interpretations that certain, say, liberals used to argue for, say, Roe v. Wade were maybe misguided. Why do you think that people on the left haven't maybe taken a legal tact with attacking the Second Amendment? Or why do you think that the left side of the debate has been so left behind in the gun rights debate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think tactically there's a lot of agreement that the left's big mistake has been to attack people who own guns as somehow wrong-headed, as opposed to making a constitutional argument. They're both weak constitutional arguments, but for different reasons. The right to privacy, defense of contraception and abortion or gay rights was really imposed from the outside. That comes from the Supreme Court. Women and reproduction are not in the Constitution, so any argument about reproduction has to be made really by analogy, which is why it's a weak argument. It's because women weren't in the Constitution and reproduction is not in the Constitution. Guns are in the Constitution, But the move that the right has made to reinterpret that amendment has been, in some kind of odd ways, to align its argument with other right seekers who were successful in the 20th century. So the rights revolution that begins with Brown v. Board in 1954, where a group of American citizens press claims for constitutional remedy for laws that are oppressing them. The right wanted its own constitutional rights fight because these fights had been very effective at mobilizing liberals in that kind of 1954 to 1968 era. And so kind of pressing for gun rights as a constitutional right was a way to kind of almost really to pick a fight. Do you know what I mean? Like to kind of create a political problem that could be solved only by urgently getting people to the polls because the left was going to take your guns away. It's a really weird move. But before the NRA made that move in the 1970s, the Second Amendment was often talked about as the lost amendment because nobody ever cited it. Like it just didn't come up. It really wasn't a contested matter. You know, Gary Wills wrote this great essay in the New York Review of Books around the time of the Waco in Oklahoma City and the sort of that big kind of militia movement moment in the early 90s, in which he said, you know, you don't use the right to bear arms to kill a rabbit. Like it doesn't have anything to do with hunting or, you know, sportsmanship or the things. You know, many people own guns for all kinds of reasons. They're not forming an insurrection against the government, and their right to bear arms is not being infringed by a government that says, you know, we have a right to pass laws. You can't carry guns in a city of this density, if, for instance, that were a law that were considered. So it's a really interesting political maneuver that's in a way an answer to the political movement of the left.
So this is Nate here. I could make an argument, and maybe I halfway believe this, that number one, it's a really weirdly written amendment, which says a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed.
Lots of commas.
Lots of commas. It's weirdly written. There's weird capitalization. It looks kind of like a Trump tweet or something almost. But I could argue, number one, it's ambiguous whether the right is conditioned on a well-regulated militia or if that's just like an aside, if that's just context that they provide. And secondly, I believe that the Constitution, when there are ambiguous cases, should be read to ensure more freedom and less government authority, and therefore I am willing to take a broadly interpreted Second Amendment and also take a broadly interpreted right to privacy and also take, you know, gay marriage and all these things that are all part of a living, breathing Constitution. I mean, is that not like what parts of that devil's advocate case, which again, I might believe or I might not, would you pick apart?
Well, it is an ambiguously worded amendment. It went through many drafts. The original draft is quite different and has been the subject of a great deal of study and argumentation. And the 1982 congressional report, which I think is called To Keep and Bear Arms, made the argument that the commas matter in this way and not that. And what's been misunderstood and the reason the amendment has been lost all this time is that people have failed to pay attention to the punctuation. So there's a huge body of scholarship that looks very closely at this textual matter. I guess one answer I might have for you is that how you might want to insist on this close textual reading is itself a political product of an argument that original meaning is what should dictate our jurisprudence. That was a political argument that was made at a particular moment in time by particular people who were advancing a particular agenda. That is a debatable proposition. We don't have that debate because this has not generally been a particularly free and full debate.
Jill, I know you got to get out of here in a second, so let me ask you this, I think, to end on. You know, one thing we were struggling with in preparing for this segment is sort of how to treat the NRA. How much of the focus when we're telling the story of the gun debate in America should go to the NRA, and in what respect?
I think the role of the NRA had a heyday and demanded more respect and understanding what was going on 10 years ago than in understanding what's going on now. So I think if you're interested in answering the question, how much attention do we pay to the NRA, I think you have to pay a lot of attention to the NRA historically.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, with this change of its mission and the change of its leadership and a new priority placed on entering party politics, and to understand the role of the NRA in energizing an emerging new right. I think you can look at it at the congressional level in the decade following, say through the 1980s and into the 1990s. I think today much of the role of the NRA is largely mythical, and it plays the same kind of boogeyman role in the left that Planned Parenthood plays in the right. Right? I mean, people who own guns are not bad people. People who use contraception are not bad people. We have let this religious zealotry infect all of our politics and bring the zeal of religious schism to political difference. That's the error, but that is largely fictional and I think, if we could only get ourselves out of this technological trap that wants to keep us held within the prison of these ideas, we could have a much broader understanding of a continuum of political opinion and not sort of sort people into, are you pro or anti-NRA? That's a ridiculous proposition.
I mean, certainly the notion, and again, I'm going to play grew up in a Midwestern college town because it's probably right in the middle of the spectrum as far as like the percentage of people who own guns. I do think there's something like the fact that this is a lifestyle choice that a lot of people are making and have made for years. And so, one can understand where, I mean, we've talked on this show before about like bubbles and how you get in your thought bubble and you kind of, I mean, this is kind of before there was Trump and like the Real America Trump voter thing. This is kind of one of those differences that's always existed, that there are parts of the country where almost every household has a gun. You go to the store and you can buy a gun, and there are parts of the country where it's extremely rare to own guns. It's stating the obvious, but the fact that like kind of the political discourse often occurs on the one hand within those bubbles. On the other hand, you have rural areas that are overrepresented, whether it's by design or not. I could ask maybe about the Constitution, but overrepresented in kind of all aspects of government, in the Electoral College, even more profoundly, though, in the Senate. And that kind of would make gun ownership debates different than they would be if California had 20 senators or whatever.
I will say, though, I mean, one thing that really struck me, and this, the stat comes from 2012, but it said that 1 in 3 Americans know someone who's been shot. So that does say something about, while gun ownership might be celebrated culturally in rural America, guns exist everywhere, and gun violence, often domestic violence, disproportionately affects women, and guns are often brought into that sometimes. So I just think it's important to remember that 1 in 3 Americans know someone who's been shot. And so it's not all confined to rural versus suburban versus urban.
All right, well, we'll leave this part of the conversation there. Jill, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Jill Lepore is a professor of American history at Harvard and staff writer at The New Yorker, where she wrote the piece Battleground America, One Nation Under the Gun. In our final segment today, we're going to shift our focus forward and ask if there are any scenarios in which we see the dynamics in the gun debate shifting. And so to begin with, I think oftentimes when a mass shooting happens, we often hear people asking if, this is the inflection point, if this is the event that really changes how we look at things, how we talk about things. Is there any reason to believe that this latest shooting in Parkland is that inflection point?
One thing I will say about the Parkland students, I don't think we've seen victims politicize the event so quickly and so soon. I think Newtown became a rallying point. And eventually, and many of those parents started speaking out, and there were conspiracy theorists who said Newtown never happened, it was all a lie, and people really tried to push back. But those, and it was heartbreaking because those were very young children, and even if you were a survivor of Newtown, you wouldn't have been able to speak out directly. But these are high school students who are, frankly, suburban kids at a good school. There's a certain sense of and I mean this positively, a certain sense of entitlement in their speaking out and a support in their community that I think has sort of been arresting to watch. These are this is a confident community of suburban high school kids who have never been told to not say something. And I think you'll often see with, a lot of people who are victims of gun violence are, maybe from minority communities, and the victims in those instances are often given less attention. And I just think it's important to point that out, too, that often victims of gun violence in suburban areas, and I've seen this personally, if you're a white family or if you're in a predominantly white community, the gun violence gets more attention and the victims get more attention because they are, what do we quote unquote like to say, likable victims or perfect victims. So I think that there's been something striking about this group of high school students being a sort of, in your face political movement moment.
There's a research paper that we were looking at that argues that one of the reasons gun rights advocates have been more successful is because the issue taps into an already existing network effect, right? Where you have people going to ranges, you have gun clubs, you have magazines these people are reading, and so it's easier to mobilize that side of the argument. There's poll results that show that side is more likely to call members of Congress. So one thing that'll be really interesting to me is what if the gun control side taps into the schools network, right? So it's like students, PTA groups.
Yeah.
That could be super successful.
Sort of like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right?
Exactly,
That was a movement that was that had, frankly, incredible impact on state laws.
So if I were a gun control advocate, I think I'd be trying to start that, trying to tap into the existing infrastructure that exists among schools.
Yeah, I mean, because you haven't really had attempts. So Michael Bloomberg had a group, Everytown for Gun Safety, which I think has not made a huge impact on the debate, although it only has something like 1/10 or 1/15 of the funding of the NRA. So even with Bloomberg's money, the NRA is a very well-funded, big lobbying organization. But yeah, I mean, that point I think is important, that there's no club for people who don't own guns. Maybe they go out to brunch or something instead. I'm not sure. But students can potentially motivate that. We should say, too, this is a town in Florida that voted for, actually, I don't know the town. I know Broward County voted for Hillary Clinton 66% to 31%. So it's a kind of pretty liberal area, and I would imagine in South Florida, pretty well-educated area, too. And so you definitely have students who are if you do hear the students, the first time you hear them, it is shocking isn't quite the right word, but we're so used to victims playing a certain role.
Yeah.
And kind of only being allowed to speak from an emotional place, that they're being quite pointed and direct and kind of saying, no one on our side of the argument. And again, these probably are students who, to begin with, kind of met the characteristics of people who weren't pro-gun, right? They're not saying their minds were changed, but they're saying no one on our side of the field has picked up the football, which is lying there, right? And we're the best people to run with it. Because no one else has really done anything about it. No one else is organized enough or kind of makes the issue front of mind enough. I mean, if you look at so Gallup periodically says, what's the most important issue in America? And guns is at 1%, except after the Las Vegas shooting, it went to 5 and 6% for a month or 2 months, and then goes right back down to 1%. And so, in some ways, the left has to decide to prioritize this issue more than other issues. That involves trade-offs, right? That means putting political energy. So now, for example, let's say you have a candidate in a suburban area in Pennsylvania, and you have a Democratic primary, and one candidate is pro-gun rights and one candidate is pro-gun control. It used to be the kind of savvy people would say, oh, you let the kind of gun rights guy win, right? This is the one issue that he can be kind of conservative on, and everything else, right? He'll be kind of a down-the-line liberal. Well, liberals have to decide, maybe we're not willing to make a compromise there anymore, and maybe we're not willing to have as much news cycles devoted to debating other issues that we care about, the minimum wage, right, or something, for example. You have to invest in it as something that you prioritize.
Do we see any trends? Obviously, there are some clear trends in the past decades in favor of gun rights. Do we see that shifting at all?
I think the point I said earlier about now Trump and Republicans are in charge of all levels of government, including at the state level in most states. That might change later this year. I think that could shift the polarity on the debate a little bit. Because again, kind of protecting public safety is one of those things that even the most narrow definition of what government's jurisdiction is would fall into that category. So I don't know. I mean, I think it might be one of these things where the numbers shift back more toward the gun control side for a couple of years until Democrats get in power, and then we'll see where public opinion really lies up. One more thing I want to say that would go to the point earlier about kind of polls versus reality. There were a couple of ballot initiatives in states in 2016 to strengthen background checks.
That passed.
No, one of them failed. In Maine, which is a pretty pro-gun state, but it failed, and Nevada, it passed by only by a point or something. And so there is some question of kind of when you try and translate these abstract ideas in polls into actual kind of policy questions, and the debate's frame. But, the other thing that I'm just kind of citing, because I did do my research, Micah, the other thing that was striking that I want to reemphasize is that, from the Pew poll that showed that, gun rights advocates are, 2.5 more times likely to, have contacted their congressmen, or gun owners, I should say, right, are, 2.5 times more likely to be in contact and politically active to donate money on those issues than gun control supporters are. So what you probably need is maybe these kids will lead it. You probably need on the left some centralized group that is identifiable, maybe not as much as the NRA, but more so than Bloomberg's group, who I'm forgetting the name, right? But
Everytown for Gun Safety.
Yeah.
Nate, I'd be skeptical that the overall numbers on guns will change, but I think what might happen and what the gun control side should want to happen is for questions like the how likely are you to contact your member of Congress questions, that could change. So you'll see, we kind of touched on this earlier, but maybe you'll see this become more of a priority for the left, and, it'll become like healthcare or something.
I mean, you probably need both, right? Thermostatically, you need that shift, which you might predict just because Trump's in power, and so it shifts, again, in the opposite direction of the party in power. But yeah, you definitely need much greater activation where it's a voting issue for twice as many Democrats as it is now. It has to be a big jump in the prominence that individual voters are placing on it, and that probably requires some type of large scale organization.
But do we think that's, not to be politically crass about this, but is that a good move for Democrats to prioritize this issue? If you think about them coming out of the 2016 election, a lot of Democrats were saying, we need to win white rural voters.
Okay, well, let me give a crass response, right? And it's a question Democrats have to answer for themselves, too, right? Which is, what happens if Democrats win the suburbs? What if we sacrifice rural areas, but we're winning the suburbs? That's clearly one of the strategies in play for Democrats hoping to do well in 2018. How's that look as a strategy? Because if you can make this about the suburbs and about schools in the suburbs, and most of these schools are in the suburbs, they're not in super rural areas.
Win that way.
And they're not in inner cities. There are different problems in inner cities. But, that would be the calculation that they make. But you're right that it comes along at a time when Democrats are looking for issues to reach out to rural voters. And remember, Bernie Sanders famously wants to reach out to rural voters on economic populism and has been kind of wishy-washy on guns from his career. And Vermont's an example of how actually, Vermont's a fairly pro-gun rights state and says that it is more urban versus rural than it is necessarily just liberal versus conservative. But you're right. It kind of comes along at a time when exactly the type of voters that Democrats are most concerned about are the type of voters who might not be with them on gun control.
So you two are really focusing on gun control as an issue that really motivates people. But just taking a step back, I mean, right, during the 2016 election, we saw Republican primary voters vote for a candidate who basically did a 180 on things that we consider pillars of the conservative movement, like free trade, Russian relations, leadership qualities. Are guns more of a cultural association on the right, or is this a sincerely held belief? Is it the actual policy that matters? So asking this in maybe easier terms, if the right Republican came along, say, and supported stricter gun control laws, but was maybe right in all the cultural associations, I mean, could Republicans get on board? And that kind of goes to your point about Bernie Sanders. If he can connect with rural voters on economic populism, can that trump the gun debate?
I think two things, right? I think, number one of the lessons of the last few years is that political opinion is more malleable than people might assume, and that positions that are strongly held for long periods of time can shift. I think maybe lesson number two is that the mechanisms by which those shift are somewhat unpredictable. As we were debating this segment, I think George Clooney just announced he was going to donate $500,000 to the student group in Parkland. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the cultural association that you would want.
I actually think it's think it's sort of a damaging one in some ways. Jill Lepore made an analog of the NRA is the conservative equivalent of Planned Parenthood, and one thing that has gotten Planned Parenthood sort of quite a lot of attention on the left and certain good fundraising dollars, but it has lent itself to caricature on the right because it's often celebrities who are stumping for it or whatever. And now that's I think gendered in some ways, but I do think the idea that celebrities sort of take on a pet cause and then parachute in and maybe Bigfoot certain causes can be a thing. Like, I remember a while back, Amy Schumer was doing some sort of promotion for, Gun Violence Awareness Day. And she posted basically like a nude picture of herself and was like, I felt it was a Actually, Amy Schumer is the only person who's ever blocked me on Twitter, to my knowledge, because I basically like quoted the tweet and was like, well, this is in bad taste. Because I thought it was.
Amy, unblock Claire. This is unacceptable.
But I just think it's like there's like a certain, people will say this is a good cause, but then you can often see like people parachuting in. In some ways, this is like a bad analogy, but in Georgia 6, the way people were like, oh, like let's go like swarm this thing instead of
for our own purposes.
Instead of letting people, like, one of the reasons why I think these high schoolers are becoming sort of a powerful thing is it happened to them and it's their thing, and it's not like it's great to have fundraising dollars, but it's not about Clooney.
This goes back, I think, ultimately to Claire's point earlier, which was this is so much about identity. I don't think guns are like free trade. I don't think there were many Republicans before Trump who were like, I consider free trade sort of core to my political identity. Now, that said, I don't think that precludes some background check bill becoming a law or something like that. I would be very surprised by a 180 on guns among Republicans in the same way we saw in free trade or Russia.
Yeah,
or Putin.
I actually think a similar cultural issue in some ways, or maybe something that mirrors like a small slice of American society having a really strong affiliation with something is, for instance, like service in the military.
Yeah.
Like, I thought one of the most striking things of the past months of the Trump administration was John Kelly's press conference, where he basically said, like, if you haven't served in the military, or if you don't know someone who served in the military, you can't ask me a question, which I was sort of affronted by from a press freedom sense of things, because it was happening. It was a press conference. It was happening in the press room. But his larger point was basically, listen, most of you people haven't served. By most of you people, his implication was you liberal elites, because he was talking to the media, and that's the Trump's view of the media, Trump White House's view of the media. But I did take a broader point. I had a lot of issues with that, but I did take a broader point of the demographics of who serves in the military is narrow.
Right.
And it's not, and I'm not just saying it's white rural people, because that's not true. But you will find that a plurality of America's military veterans live in rural America, and that's a thing. And I think that's like I think the gun debate in some ways speaks to these slices of American culture that have really deep, strong ties for whatever reason, deep emotional pulls.
Yeah. So to sort of put a bow on this, I think there will be gun control legislation in two scenarios. One, the issue becomes kind of fully polarized. Both sides care really deeply about it, and Democrats get in power. Or two, the issue or certain parts of the issue get removed from that core cultural identity thingy and become just less of a thing.
Two is a lot more likely, and the reason why is because...
Oh, you think two is more likely?
I'm not saying it's likely. I'm saying it's more likely than one. Because the problem with one is like, the bias of the Senate toward rural states
right.
is quite profound, because Heidi Heitkamp or Joe Manchin or whatever...
they're not going to vote for...
They're going to be hard pressed,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? This is the last thing, and they might be completely wrong, but this is the last thing that they want to like make a big partisan show over. So until their attitude changes, I mean, I wasn't sure whether John Kasich has kind of flip-flopped and now said...
He's completely erased his gun section from his website.
So I'm not sure whether John Kasich is a leading indicator or a lagging indicator or a contrarian one or what, right? But people like that are probably more important. So, Republicans in purple states and Democrats, to the extent they still have any, in red states. Watch them.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on those dynamics in the months to come. And for now, that's a wrap. So thank you, Nate.
Thank you.
Claire, thank you.
Thanks, Galen.
And Micah, thanks to you.
You're welcome.
My name is Galen Druk. Our politics editor is Micah Cohen. Tony Chow is in the control room. You can get in touch by emailing us at podcasts@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions you might have. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a rating or review in the Apple Podcast Store. When you leave a rating, it helps our rankings, which helps others discover the show. Or just tell somebody about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.